In a country with over 2,000 inmates waiting to die, fewer than 50 are women. But when women kill, the violence cuts deeper. It feels more deliberate, more shocking, because these aren't just murders. They are betrayals of everything we expect women to be. Mothers, wives, friends, caregivers. Some drowned their own children in lakes and rivers. Others lured victims with soft voices and easy trust, only to unleash unspeakable cruelty. There are women who burned their families alive for insurance money, who tortured strangers for revenge, who poisoned the people they claimed to love. From the infamous Deadly Seven of Texas to the scattered cells of death rows in Florida, Georgia, Arizona, and California, these are not legends, not rumors. These are real women, alive, condemned. Watch this full breakdown of the 30 most terrifying female prisoners on death row. Darlie Routier. Crime, murder. Darlie Routier was the picture of a suburban Texas mother, blonde, bubbly, with 2 sweet young boys, and a picture-perfect home in Rowlett. To her neighbors, she seemed devoted, doting, and living the dream. But on the night of June 6, 1996, that dream dissolved into horror. A frantic 911 call echoed through the dark, Darlie sobbing, screaming that an intruder had stabbed her sons, Devin and Damon, as they slept in the family room. She was bleeding too, a gash across her throat, blood smeared everywhere. When police arrived, they found a chaotic scene. 2 little boys lay mortally wounded. Devin, just 6 years old, was already gone. Damon, only 5, struggled for breath before dying in the ambulance. Darlie herself was taken to the hospital. Initially, she was reported as a survivor of a devilish home invasion. But as investigators combed the evidence, the story began to unravel. There were no signs of forced entry. The bloody fingerprints on the walls, they matched Darlie. The kitchen knife, supposedly dropped by a fleeing intruder, was taken from her own drawer. Even the infamous bloody sock found outside could have been planted to mislead police. Then came the horrifying realization, a home video recorded just days after the murders. Darlie was seen at the gravesite, smiling, spraying silly string over her son's grave during what she called a birthday party for Devin. To detectives, it wasn't grief, it was plain evil. In 1997, Darlie Routier was convicted of murdering Damon. She's been on Texas death row ever since, insisting she's innocent. Some supporters believe the evidence was flawed, a rush to judgment, but prosecutors remain convinced there was no intruder. If the state carries out her sentence, Darlie will become one of the few American mothers executed for killing her own children. She still claims she loved them, but the jury decided she loved something else more. Linda Carty. Crime, robbery, and murder. Linda Carty was once a school teacher and an informant for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Born in St. Kitts and raised in the Caribbean, she seemed charming, educated, and soft-spoken. But beneath that calm face, prosecutors say, was an obsession waiting to kill. In May 2001, Linda's desperate desire for a child drove her to plan a crime almost too shocking to believe. At 42, she lied to friends and lovers, claiming she was pregnant. But the truth was far darker. Linda couldn't have more children, so she decided to take someone else's. Her target was 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez, a young mother who had just given birth. According to testimony, Linda enlisted 3 men, promising them drugs and money to help carry out a twisted plan. They broke into Joanna's Houston apartment in the middle of the night, tied up Joanna and her husband, and kidnapped her at gunpoint, along with her newborn baby boy. Joanna was later found stuffed in the trunk of a car Linda had rented. She'd been gagged and suffocated to death, while her infant son was miraculously still alive, barely clinging to life. When police arrested Linda, they found baby clothes, diapers, and bottles waiting at her home. To investigators, it was clear she intended to raise the child as her own. At trial, Linda claimed she was innocent. She said she had been framed by the men she trusted, and that as a DEA informant, she was being set up in retaliation. But the jury didn't believe her. The evidence, the car rental, the baby supplies, and the eyewitness accounts was overwhelming. In 2002, Linda Carty was sentenced to death. Ever since, her story has been dissected, questioned, and endlessly debated. The British government, because Linda holds UK citizenship, has condemned the trial, citing poor legal representation and a lack of forensic evidence directly linking her to the killing. Celebrities and human rights groups have pleaded for clemency. Yet, after more than 2 decades on Texas death row, Linda remains where she's always been, in a tiny cell, waiting for the state to decide if she lives or dies. Erica Shepard. Crime, capital murder. Erica Shepard's journey to Texas death row began with a senseless killing that left even seasoned detectives shaken. In June 1993, 19-year-old Erica, along with a friend, James Dickerson, targeted 43-year-old Marilyn Sage, a woman known for her kindness and generosity. Marilyn lived in a modest home in Houston, always willing to lend a helping hand, but that trust later became her downfall. According to prosecutors, Erica and Dickerson hatched a plan to rob Marilyn. They needed her car, her money, anything they could take. Armed with nothing but desperation and cruelty, they tricked their way into her home. Once inside, the robbery turned vicious. Marilyn was bound with duct tape, gagged, and forced to kneel. In the final moments of her life, she was bludgeoned with a steam iron. Then, in an act of sheer brutality, she was stabbed more than a dozen times with a pair of scissors. Erica later claimed she didn't deliver the fatal blows, that Dickerson was the true killer. But the evidence told another story. Marilyn's blood was found on Erica's shoes and clothes. Fingerprints linked her directly to the scene. And during questioning, she gave a gross and emotionless statement that sealed her fate. The stolen items were pawned for pocket change. Marilyn's car was abandoned. And for what? A handful of dollars and a fleeting thrill. In 1995, a jury convicted Erica of capital murder and sentenced her to death. She was just 21 years old. Over the years, Erica's lawyers have tried to argue that her troubled upbringing and history of abuse should spare her life. But appeals have failed. The courts have upheld her sentence at every turn. Today, Erica sits on Texas death row, one of the youngest women ever condemned in the state. She has been there for decades, her name rarely making headlines, her case largely forgotten except by Marilyn Sage's grieving family. When her day of reckoning comes, it will be for a crime as cold and senseless as they come. Brittany Holberg. Crime, murder. In November 1996, Brittany was a 23-year-old prostitute in Amarillo, addicted to crack cocaine and spiraling out of control. She needed money fast. Her target became an elderly man she knew. 80-year-old A.B. Towery Sr., a retired welder who lived alone. She went to his home under the pretense of borrowing something, but once inside, the encounter turned savage. Prosecutors said Brittany attacked Towery with a hammer, a knife, and finally, a lamp. She stabbed him 58 times, drove a paring knife through his eye, and left him with more than 60 injuries in total. When investigators arrived, the scene was like something out of a horror movie. Blood smeared on walls, floors, and furniture. Towery's body was barely recognizable. After killing him, Brittany rifled through his pockets, stole $1,400, and fled. She used the cash to buy more drugs. Brittany was caught days later in a seedy motel in Florida, hiding out. She confessed to the killing but claimed it was self-defense, that Towery had tried to sexually assault her, and she lashed out. The jury didn't believe her. The mercilessness of the crime convinced them it was cold-blooded murder for money. In 1998, Brittany Holberg was sentenced to death. On death row, she's become a controversial figure. She has spoken out about her life of abuse and addiction, painting herself as a victim of circumstance. Supporters call her execution cruel and unnecessary, but for Towery's family, the crime was too horrific to forgive. Today, Brittany Holberg remains one of the most notorious women in Texas' Gatesville unit. Her story a grim warning of how far desperation can go. Kimberly Cargill. Crime, capital murder. Kimberly Cargill was a suburban mother from Tyler, Texas, who seemed, at least on the surface, like an ordinary woman. But beneath that facade lay secrets she would kill to keep. In June 2010, Kimberly's life was unraveling. A single mother of 4, she was in the middle of a bitter custody battle, and looming over her was the testimony of Cherry Walker, her babysitter, a gentle, mentally challenged woman who had agreed to tell the court about Kimberly's neglectful parenting. Cherry was set to testify the very next day, but she never made it. Prosecutors say Kimberly lured Cherry to her home under the guise of needing help. Then she beat her, strangled her, and loaded her lifeless body into the back of her car. She drove to a rural area and set Cherry on fire, reducing her to a pile of charred remains. The motive was simple: silence. If Cherry couldn't testify, Kimberly believed she could keep custody of her children and protect herself from scrutiny. Investigators pieced the puzzle together quickly. Forensic evidence linked Kimberly to the crime scene. Witnesses saw her with Cherry shortly before her disappearance, and Kimberly's own shifting stories, denial, excuses, contradictions, only tightened the noose. At her 2012 trial, the jury heard how Kimberly had a long history of manipulation and violence. They didn't hesitate. She was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Since then, Kimberly has filed multiple appeals, claiming she's innocent and was unfairly portrayed as a monster. But the courts have upheld her sentence every time. Today, Kimberly Cargill sits on Texas death row, her fate sealed by her own desperation. All she had to do was face the truth in court. Instead, she chose fire and murder. Taylor Parker. Crime, murder. Taylor Parker's crime was so shocking, so grotesque, it left experienced crime crackers reeling. Ordinarily, Taylor seemed like a harmless young woman from Texas, but she carried such an obsession, an overwhelming need for love and validation that spiraled into madness. For months, she faked being pregnant, fooling her boyfriend, her family, even herself. She posted sonogram photos online, claimed she was expecting a baby girl, and carefully crafted the lie. But time was running out. Her fake due date was approaching and she had no child to show. On October 9, 2020, Taylor drove to the home of 21-year-old Reagan Simmons Hancock, a friendly, trusting woman who was 34 weeks pregnant. Reagan believed Taylor was her friend, but Taylor had a horrifying plan. Once inside, Taylor brutally attacked Reagan with a hammer, then stabbed her more than 100 times. And then, in an act so unthinkable, she performed a makeshift C-section, cutting Reagan's unborn baby from her womb. Taylor fled the scene with the infant, leaving Reagan's 3-year-old daughter to discover her mother's mutilated body. When police caught Taylor shortly after, she was holding the baby, claiming she had just given birth. But the child didn't survive. The crime shocked not just Texas, but the entire nation. It was nothing anyone had ever seen. At her 2022 trial, prosecutors described Taylor as a master manipulator, who lied her way through life, desperate to keep her boyfriend from leaving her. The jury took just 1 hour to sentence her to death. Taylor Parker now sits on Texas death row, awaiting the same fate she handed to an innocent mother and her unborn child. Krista Pike. Crime, capital murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. Krista Pike was only 18 years old when she committed one of the most sadistic murders in Tennessee's history, a crime so cruel it still shocks people nearly 3 decades later. It was 1995, and Krista was enrolled in a government-run Job Corps program in Knoxville, a place meant to give troubled youth a second chance at building a future. Instead, it became the backdrop for her descent into jealousy and rage. Krista had become infatuated with a fellow student, Darrell Shipp. When she convinced herself that another trainee, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, was trying to steal him away, that jealousy turned venomous. On January 12th, Krista decided to act. Pretending she wanted to make peace, she lured Colleen off campus with Darrell and another accomplice. But what Colleen thought would be a conversation turned into a living nightmare. They led her deep into a wooded, secluded area. For over 30 minutes, Krista unleashed pure brutality. She struck Colleen repeatedly with a chunk of asphalt, slashed her chest with a box cutter, and even carved a pentagram into her skin. The entire time, Krista mocked her, taunting her as she cried and begged for her life. Finally, as Colleen lay bleeding and broken, Krista ended it by smashing her skull with a large rock. And then came the most chilling part. Krista kept a fragment of Colleen's skull as a trophy. She didn't hide her crime. By the next day, Krista was bragging to classmates detailing the murder with disturbing pride. Police didn't have to investigate for long. She confessed openly, showing no remorse. At trial, her lawyers argued she was young, unstable, and easily influenced by her boyfriend, but the savagery of the act silenced any sympathy. In 1996, Krista Pike became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the U.S. since capital punishment was reinstated. Today, decades later, she remains on Tennessee's death row, her execution stalled by appeals. Krista's crime wasn't about money or revenge. It was about raw, sadistic pleasure, and it forever cemented her place in American true crime. Tina Brown. Crime, premeditated first-degree murder. Tina Brown's crime in Pensacola, Florida, was as cruel and mindless. In March 2010, Tina, along with her teenage daughter and 2 accomplices, targeted 19-year-old Seth Jackson, a young man caught in a web of jealousy and lies. Seth had once dated Tina's daughter, and when the relationship soured, rumors of betrayal and insults escalated into deadly rage. Tina lured Seth to a house under the pretense of resolving their issues. But once he arrived, the trap was set. What followed was a calculated ambush. Seth was beaten with wooden boards and fists. He tried to escape but was dragged back. Tina and the others shot him, then shoved his still-breathing body into a bathtub. They broke his knees to fit him into a sleeping bag, then carried him outside and set him on fire. When the fire didn't fully destroy him, they burned him again in a backyard fire pit, leaving only fragments of bone and ash. The motive? Petty jealousy and revenge. Nothing more. Investigators pieced together the timeline quickly. Text messages, witness accounts, and confessions unraveled the conspiracy. At her 2013 trial, prosecutors called Tina the ringleader, the adult who orchestrated and encouraged teenagers to torture and kill. The jury agreed. Tina Brown was sentenced to death for the brutal murder, her name forever tied to one of Florida's most disturbing cases. She now waits on Florida's death row, one example of how easily ordinary anger can twist into compulsive murder. Tiffany Moss. Crime, murder. Tiffany Moss was a quiet stepmother in suburban Georgia, living an unremarkable life with her husband and their children. But behind the closed doors of their Lawrenceville apartment, she committed a crime so cruel it horrified everyone. In 2013, Tiffany and her husband Emanuele locked his 10-year-old daughter, Imani, in a small, windowless room. Imani had always been a sweet, gentle child, but Tiffany saw her as a burden. Over weeks, she deliberately starved the little girl. When Imani became too weak to stand, Tiffany ignored her. Neighbors later testified they never saw the child. When teachers asked about her absence from school, Tiffany claimed she was sick. By the time Imani died, she weighed only 32 pounds, skin and bone. Instead of calling for help, Tiffany and her husband placed the child's body in a trash bag, drove it to a secluded area, and burned it to hide the evidence. When police uncovered the crime, the details were startling. Imani's room was filthy, smeared with human waste. Investigators said it was more like a cage than a bedroom. Tiffany showed no emotion during questioning, calmly admitting what happened. At her 2019 trial, she chose not to defend herself. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. The jury deliberated only a few hours before sentencing her to death, calling it one of the most heartless crimes in Georgia's history. Today, Tiffany Moss remains on Georgia's death row, a woman who starved a child she was supposed to protect. Even in a gallery of monsters, her silence speaks the loudest. Antoinette Frank. Crime: 3 counts of first-degree murder. Antoinette Frank once wore the badge of a New Orleans police officer. She was supposed to serve and protect. Instead, she used her uniform as a weapon. On the night of March 4, 1995, Frank and her teenage accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, walked into Kim An, a small Vietnamese restaurant where she had worked security in the past. The owners trusted her. They let her in without hesitation. But Frank wasn't there to eat. She and Lacaze drew their guns and demanded cash. When Officer Ronald Williams, a fellow cop working off-duty security, tried to intervene, Frank shot him dead. Then she turned her weapon on 2 young restaurant workers, Ha Vu and her brother, Quang Vu, killing them in cold blood. The only survivor was another sibling hiding under a table who witnessed the horror unfold. The motive was painfully simple: money. Antoinette was drowning in debt. She needed cash, and she knew the restaurant kept large sums on hand. Her plan was calculated, and her badge gave her the perfect cover, but her downfall was just as quick. Investigators quickly linked her to the crime through the survivor's eyewitness account, shell casings, and security camera footage. When she was arrested, Frank showed little remorse. At her 1995 trial, prosecutors called her one of the most dangerous criminals in New Orleans history, a cop who betrayed everything the uniform stands for. The jury agreed. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. To this day, Antoinette Frank remains on Louisiana's death row, her name a stain on the city's police force. Blanche Taylor Moore. Crime: first-degree murder. Blanche Taylor Moore looked like the perfect Southern lady, polite, church-going, and charming, but behind her sweet smile was a taste for poison. In the 1980s, Blanche lived in North Carolina and worked as a grocery store clerk. She had a history of relationships with men who mysteriously fell ill. Her first husband, James Taylor, died in 1973 after months of unexplained sickness. Years later, her boyfriend Raymond Reed also suffered a slow, agonizing decline before his death in 1986. It wasn't until 1989 when Blanche's fiancé, Reverend Dwight Moore, suddenly collapsed from violent stomach pain that suspicions grew. Doctors discovered dangerous levels of arsenic in his system. enough to kill him several times over. Miraculously, Dwight survived. Investigators exhumed the bodies of Blanche's former lovers. The results were striking. Both were packed with arsenic. It became clear that Blanche had been poisoning the men closest to her for years, likely motivated by insurance money and personal convenience. When questioned, Blanche maintained her innocence, acting shocked and offended by the accusations. But the evidence, traces of arsenic, medical records, and her financial gain was overwhelming. At her 1990 trial, prosecutors painted Blanche as a serial killer who weaponized trust. The jury needed little time to convict her of first-degree murder for the death of Raymond Reed. She was sentenced to death, making her one of the few women on North Carolina's death row. Now in her 90s, Blanche Taylor Moore still sits behind bars, appealing her sentence while denying everything. She may look like a kindly grandmother, but her victims would tell a different story, if they could. Robin Lee Rowe. Crime, 3 counts, murder. Robin Lee Rowe's crime shattered an entire family and horrified the small community of Boise, Idaho. On February 10, 1992, a devastating fire ripped through the home of Robin's estranged husband, Randy Rowe. Trapped inside were Randy and the couple's 2 young children, 10-year-old Joshua and 8-year-old Tabitha. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. All 3 were dead. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident, but investigators quickly noticed strange details. There was no sign of an electrical malfunction. Gasoline residue was found near the scene, and Robin's behavior raised suspicion. She showed little visible grief and immediately filed claims on multiple life insurance policies totaling over $250. The deeper detectives dug, the darker the picture became. Robin had a history of fire-related tragedies. Years earlier, her first child had also died in a mysterious house fire, and another blaze destroyed her previous apartment under questionable circumstances. When confronted, Robin denied everything, but evidence told another story. Financial motives, the timing of the fire, and her mounting debts all pointed to deliberate arson. At her 1993 trial, prosecutors argued that Robin saw her family not as loved ones but as obstacles, standing between her and a fresh start with money in her pocket. The jury agreed. Robin Lee Rowe was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, becoming the first and only woman on Idaho's death row. Even decades later, she maintains her innocence, but the facts remain. 2 children and a father died in flames set by someone they trusted most. Robin traded her family for cash and lost everything. Brenda Andrew. Crime, murder. Brenda Andrew seemed like a devoted wife and mother living a quiet life in Oklahoma City. But beneath the suburban facade, she was plotting her husband's murder. Brenda was unhappy in her marriage to Rob Andrew. She had rekindled a romance with an old high school boyfriend, James Pavat, who also happened to be the couple's insurance agent. Together, they hatched a deadly plan. On November 20th, 2001, Brenda lured Rob to their home under the guise of picking up their children. As he stepped into the garage, James ambushed him with a shotgun. Rob was shot twice at close range. Brenda staged the scene to look like a botched burglary, knocking over items and leaving doors ajar, but the act was sloppy. Investigators quickly realized nothing valuable was taken. Even more suspicious, Brenda had recently increased Rob's life insurance policy to $800,000. With James as the agent, when police began asking questions, Brenda and James fled to Mexico, leaving her 2 children behind. After 2 months on the run, they were captured and extradited back to the U.S. At her 2004 trial, prosecutors painted Brenda as a manipulative woman who killed for greed and lust. The evidence was overwhelming: the affair, the insurance motive, and her flight from justice. The jury sentenced her to death. Today, Brenda Andrew remains the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. She still maintains she's innocent, but the trail of betrayal and greed says otherwise. She promised forever in marriage, then turned it into a death sentence. Virginia Caudill. Crime, robbery, and murder. Virginia Caudill's crime shocked Lexington, Kentucky, with a new high level of unspeakable terror. In March 1998, Virginia and her boyfriend Jonathan Goforth needed money. They decided to rob 73-year-old Lynetta White, a kind widow who had once let Virginia stay in her home. It was a betrayal that turned fatal. Late at night, Virginia and Jonathan broke into Lynetta's house. When the elderly woman woke and recognized them, they panicked. Lynetta was beaten repeatedly with a hammer, then stuffed into the trunk of her own car. They drove her to a remote area, still alive, and left her there. By the time police found her, she had suffocated. The pair then ransacked Lynetta's home, stealing cash, jewelry, and valuables they later pawned for drug money. When investigators caught up with Virginia, she tried to blame Jonathan entirely, claiming she never wanted Lynetta harmed. But the evidence told a different story. Fingerprints, stolen property, and witness testimony tied her directly to the crime. At her 2000 trial, prosecutors called Virginia the mastermind, saying she chose an elderly victim because she thought she would be easy. The jury agreed and sentenced her to death. Today, Virginia Caudill remains the only woman on Kentucky's death row. Moral lesson: sometimes the greatest danger comes from those you trust. Donna Roberts. Crime, aiding and abetting murder. Donna Roberts was a 57-year-old Ohio woman who turned jealousy and greed into a deadly plot. In 2001, Donna was still legally married to 31-year-old Robert Bobby Franks, even though their relationship was strained. At the same time, she was romantically involved with another man, Nathaniel Jackson, a career criminal who had just been released from prison. Together, Donna and Nathaniel decided that Bobby had to go. On December 11, 2001, Nathaniel hid in Donna's home, waiting for Bobby to return. When Bobby walked in, Nathaniel ambushed him, shooting him multiple times. To make sure he was dead, Nathaniel slit Bobby's throat. Afterward, Donna and Nathaniel ransacked the house, attempting to make the murder look like a burglary, but investigators immediately suspected foul play. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered hundreds of letters between Donna and Nathaniel while he was in prison, letters that laid out the murder plot in chilling detail. Donna had even written instructions about Bobby's schedule and the best time to strike. At her 2003 trial, prosecutors called Donna the mastermind. Though she didn't pull the trigger, she orchestrated the killing to collect on Bobby's life insurance and start a new life with Nathaniel. The jury agreed. She became the first woman sentenced to death in Ohio in decades. Today, Donna Roberts remains on Ohio's death row, still fighting her conviction with appeals. She claimed it was love. The jury called it murder. Lisa Jo Chamberlain. Crime: 2 counts of capital murder. Lisa Jo Chamberlain's crime remains one of Mississippi's most brutal double murders. In 2004, Lisa and her boyfriend, Roger Gillett, were living with his cousin, Vernon Hewlett, and his girlfriend, Linda Heinzelman, in Hattiesburg. Tensions grew over money and living arrangements, eventually exploding into violence. One night, Lisa and Roger attacked Vernon and Linda in a rage. Vernon was beaten to death with a hammer, while Linda was strangled. But the horror didn't stop there. The couple dismembered the victims' bodies and stuffed them into a freezer. Then they stole Vernon and Linda's truck and fled to Kansas, where they were eventually caught. Investigators found the freezer containing the bodies days later, sparking national headlines. Evidence linked Lisa directly to the killings, her fingerprints, stolen belongings, and even her own words to witnesses sealed her fate. At her 2006 trial, prosecutors described Lisa as equally responsible as Roger, calling the crime sadistic and calculated. The jury came to a conclusion. She was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, becoming the first woman on Mississippi's death row in decades. Lisa Jo Chamberlain remains there today, her name forever tied to a crime so cold it literally ended in a freezer. Wendy Andriano. Crime: first-degree murder. Wendy Andriano seemed like a devoted wife and mother living in Phoenix, Arizona, but behind closed doors, she was plotting her husband's death. Her husband, Joe Andriano, was terminally ill with cancer. Instead of caring for him, Wendy began an affair and decided Joe was standing in the way of her freedom. She stood to gain financially from his death, through insurance policies and by selling their home. On October 8, 2000, Wendy poisoned Joe's food with sodium azide, a toxic chemical. But when it didn't kill him fast enough, she grabbed a bar stool and bludgeoned him repeatedly. Finally, she stabbed him in the neck to ensure he was dead. Wendy then called 911, pretending to be a panicked wife. But investigators quickly saw through her story. Her calm demeanor at the scene, combined with traces of poison and evidence of her affair, pointed to murder for money. At her 2004 trial, Wendy was portrayed as a woman ruled by greed, not conscience. The jury didn't hesitate. They gave her the death penalty. Wendy Andriano remains on Arizona's death row today, her case a chilling example of how even a caregiver can become a killer. Shauna Ford. Crime: first-degree murder. Shauna Ford was an anti-immigration activist in Arizona whose extremist views turned into a deadly home invasion. In May 2009, Shauna, then leader of the vigilante group Minutemen American Defense, conspired with two accomplices to rob a Latino family in Arivaca, Arizona. She believed they were drug dealers and would have large amounts of cash to fund her group's activities. On May 30, Shauna and her accomplices dressed in camouflage and broke into the Flores family's home, pretending to be law enforcement. Inside were Raul Flores, his wife Gina, and their 9-year-old daughter, Brisenia. The robbery quickly turned into a massacre. Raul Flores was shot multiple times at point-blank range. Then, as little Brisenia pleaded for her life, one of Shauna's accomplices shot her in the face, killing her instantly. Gina, though gravely wounded, managed to grab a gun and return fire, forcing the intruders to flee. The brutal murders of a father and his child shocked the community and made national headlines. Investigators traced the plot back to Shauna through phone records, stolen items, and testimony from her own accomplices. At her 2011 trial, prosecutors said she orchestrated the attack, motivated by racism, greed, and a desire to gain notoriety within extremist circles. The jury found her guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. Samantha Allen. Crime, child murder, and abuse. Samantha Allen's crime was one of pure cruelty, inflicted on the most vulnerable victim imaginable, a child she was supposed to protect. In 2011, Samantha and her husband, John Allen, were living with extended family in Phoenix, Arizona. Among the children in their care was 10-year-old Amy Deal, a sweet but timid girl who often bore the brunt of the household's harsh discipline. On July 12, 2011, Amy was accused of taking a popsicle without permission. For punishment, Samantha and John forced the little girl into a small plastic storage box, barely big enough for her to fit. They padlocked the box shut and left her outside in the sweltering Arizona heat, where temperatures reached over 100 degrees. Amy begged to be let out, crying that she couldn't breathe, but Samantha ignored her. Hours later, when they finally opened the box, Amy was dead from suffocation and heat. Investigators later learned this wasn't the first time Amy had been abused. She had endured beatings, humiliations, and severe punishments for years. The locked box was just the final, fatal act. At her 2017 trial, prosecutors called Samantha Allen sadistic, someone who treated a child like disposable property. She was eventually sentenced to death for the torture and murder of Amy Deal. Cynthia Kaufman. Crime, murder. Cynthia Kaufman's path to murder began with a toxic relationship and a deadly partnership. In 1986, Cynthia was living in California when she met James Marlowe, a recently paroled white supremacist. The two quickly became inseparable, bound by drugs, crime, and a violent streak that spiraled out of control. Together, they embarked on a crime spree that included robbery, kidnapping, and murder. Over the course of just a few weeks, Cynthia and James abducted 4 young women, 2 in California and 2 in Arizona. Each victim was held against her will, assaulted, and ultimately strangled to death. Their victims included 20-year-old Linnell Murray, a college student, and Sandra Neary, a newlywed. The killings shocked the public with their brutality and apparent lack of remorse. When the pair was finally caught, Cynthia initially claimed she was an unwilling participant, saying James forced her to help. But prosecutors argued she was a willing accomplice, luring women into traps and participating in their deaths. At her 1989 trial, the jury agreed with the prosecution. Cynthia Kaufman was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, becoming one of the few women on California's death row. Decades later, she remains there, a typicality of how quickly love mixed with violence can turn into a killing spree. Carrie Lynn Dalton. Crime, murder. Carrie Lynn Dalton's case is one of California's most debated death penalty convictions, a murder without a body that continues to stir controversy decades later. In 1988, Dalton was living in Oceanside and running with a crowd deep in meth addiction. Prosecutors alleged that she believed another woman, Irene Melanie May, had stolen her jewelry, a betrayal believed to be behind her extreme paranoia and rage. Witnesses claimed Dalton lured Melanie to a friend's trailer home under the guise of confronting her. What happened next was described as a chaotic, frenzied attack. According to testimony, Melanie was struck with a skillet injected with battery acid, stabbed repeatedly, and possibly even tortured with other household items. After the brutal assault, her body was allegedly dumped somewhere remote. It has never been recovered. Despite the lack of a corpse, physical evidence, or a clear crime scene, Dalton was arrested and charged with murder. The state's case relied heavily on the accounts of drug users present that night, individuals with criminal records and questionable credibility. At her 1995 trial, prosecutors painted Dalton as a sadistic, meth-fueled killer who bragged about what she'd done. Dalton has always maintained her innocence. She claims the witnesses fabricated the story to protect themselves and curry favor with authorities. Her supporters argue that no physical evidence ties her to the alleged murder. Still, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. Carrie Lynn Dalton remains on California's death row today, staring face down to an inevitable death beckoning at the end of her tunnel. Susan Eubanks. Crime, murder. Susan Eubanks committed one of the most chilling family murders in California history, a massacre that left even seasoned investigators shaken till this day. On October 27, 1997, in San Marcos, Susan was in a downward spiral. She'd been drinking heavily and fighting with her boyfriend. Her anger turned inward, then outward toward the 4 young sons she was raising, ages 4, 6, 7, and 14. In a haze of alcohol and rage, Susan loaded a .38 caliber revolver. One by one, she walked into each child's bedroom and shot them in the head as they slept. The boys never stood a chance. After killing them, Susan attempted to take her own life with the same gun, but the bullet only grazed her. When police arrived, she was eerily calm, telling officers she had done it because the boys were better off dead than living in a world where people hurt each other. The community was horrified. At trial, prosecutors argued the murders were not a spur-of-the-moment breakdown, but a calculated act of revenge aimed at punishing her boyfriend by destroying what he loved most, her children. Defense attorneys claimed Susan was mentally unstable and overwhelmed, but the jury was unmoved. In 1999, Susan Eubanks was sentenced to death for the murders. Today, she remains on California's death row, a haunting example of how rage and despair can turn a mother into a killer who annihilated her entire family in one night of madness. Rosie Alfaro. Crime, murder. Rosie Alfaro's crime shocked Orange County and left an entire community reeling over the senseless murder of an innocent child. In 1990, Rosie was just 18 years old, but her life was already consumed by drug addiction. Desperate for money to feed her habit, she targeted the home of her friend's family in Anaheim, believing it would be an easy place to steal from. On June 15, 1990, Rosie went to the Wallace home, where only 9-year-old Autumn Wallace was inside. Pretending she needed to use the phone, Rosie gained the child's trust and was let in. But instead of leaving peacefully, Rosie grabbed a knife from the kitchen and launched a frenzied attack. Autumn was stabbed more than 50 times. After the brutal murder, Rosie rifled through the house, stealing small valuables, including jewelry, to pawn for drugs. She left the little girl's body behind, showing no remorse. Within days, police arrested Rosie, who confessed but later tried to claim she'd been hallucinating and hadn't meant to kill Autumn. Prosecutors dismissed that defense, saying the sheer number of stab wounds proved deliberate, intentional rage. In 1992, a jury convicted Rosie Alfaro of first-degree murder with special circumstances. She became the first woman ever sentenced to death in Orange County. Manling Chong Williams. Crime, murder. Manling Chong Williams committed one of the most shocking and coldly calculated family murders in Rowland Heights, California. On August 7, 2000, while her husband Neil Williams slept peacefully in their home, Manling picked up a samurai-style sword and launched a vicious attack. She slashed and stabbed him over 90 times, leaving the father of her 2 children almost unrecognizable. But the horror didn't end there. After murdering Neil, Manling walked into the bedrooms of their 2 young sons, aged just 3 and 7. Instead of sparing them, she calmly smothered each child with a pillow, silencing them forever. When the killings were done, she attempted to create a facade. Manling staged the crime scene to look like a murder-suicide and even called 911, pretending to be a distraught wife who had just discovered her family dead. But detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies in her story, and forensic evidence dismantled her lies. The motive was as heartless as the crime. Prosecutors revealed that Manling wanted to escape her life and be free to pursue an online affair with another man. Divorce, she claimed, felt impossible, so she chose murder instead. At her 2010 trial, jurors listened to chilling details of how she methodically executed her family with no genuine remorse. They deliberated only briefly before convicting her of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Angelina Rodriguez. Crime, murder. Angelina Rodriguez's crime was premeditated and ruthless, motivated entirely by greed. In 2000, Angelina poisoned her husband, Frank Rodriguez, by slipping oleander plant toxins and antifreeze into his drinks. As he grew increasingly sick, Angelina played the role of the concerned wife. But behind the facade, she was waiting for him to die so she could collect a $250,000 life insurance payout. Her criminal past made the case even more disturbing. Years earlier, her infant daughter had died under suspicious circumstances after choking on a pacifier that Angelina later sued the manufacturer over, receiving a settlement. Investigators began to suspect a pattern of manipulation, fraud, and a willingness to harm those closest to her for financial gain. Frank's death was initially ruled natural, but suspicions from family and friends led to his body being exhumed. Tests revealed the deadly mix of poisons. Police uncovered evidence that Angelina had researched toxic plants and chemicals online and had even tried to frame someone else by planting false clues. At her 2004 trial, prosecutors described her as a black widow, a woman who saw husbands and children as expendable if they stood in the way of her money and freedom. The jury deliberated less than 2 days before sentencing her to death for murder with special circumstances. Angelina Rodriguez remains on California's death row, one of the state's most infamous female killers who turned marriage into a deadly contract. Cherie Rhodes. Crime, murder. Cherie Rhodes carried out one of California's rare female-led mass shootings, a family massacre rooted in rage and decades of resentment. On February 20, 2014, tensions boiled over at the Cedarville Rancheria Tribal Office in Alturas, California. Cherie was facing eviction from tribal housing after accusations of financial mismanagement. At a scheduled eviction hearing, instead of accepting the decision, she arrived armed and ready for slaughter. As family members and tribal leaders sat in the meeting, Cherie suddenly pulled out a handgun and opened fire. She killed 4 people, including her own brother and niece, and injured 2 others who desperately tried to flee. When she ran out of bullets, Cherie grabbed a butcher knife and continued her attack, stabbing one of the wounded victims before others managed to tackle and restrain her. Witnesses later described the scene as complete chaos, with children crying and survivors covered in blood. The motive was both personal and prideful. Cherie was enraged at being stripped of her tribal status and home. Investigators said she felt humiliated and wanted revenge on those she believed betrayed her. At her 2016 trial, prosecutors highlighted her lack of remorse, pointing to her cold demeanor even when describing the killings. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death, making her one of the few female mass shooters on California's death row. Maureen Mickey McDermott. Crime, attempted murder, and first-degree murder. Maureen Mickey McDermott was a seemingly ordinary nurse living in Van Nuys, California. To her friends and co-workers, she came across as fun-loving and ambitious, but behind the charm she harbored a cold, calculated plan to secure a future she didn't want to work for. In 1985, Maureen befriended her tenant, 27-year-old Stephen Hyde, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Stephen had no idea that Maureen had secretly taken out a life insurance policy on him, naming herself as the sole beneficiary. She even bragged to people that she was working on a retirement plan that didn't involve long hours at the hospital. Her so-called plan was as chilling as it was simple: have Stephen killed and collect the payout. Maureen hired two men to do her bidding. On April 28, 1985, they ambushed Stephen in his apartment. He was stabbed a staggering 65 times in a frenzied attack meant to look like a botched robbery. The scene was brutal and bloody, yet investigators quickly suspected it was no random crime. Police uncovered a trail of incriminating evidence. Witnesses recalled Mickey openly joking about murder for hire. The hitmen themselves confessed, revealing how she promised them a cut of the insurance money in exchange for taking Stephen's life. At her 1990 trial, Mickey never showed remorse, even as the evidence piled up. The jury was convinced of her guilt and sentenced her to death, making her the first woman on California's death row in decades. Maureen McDermott remains there today, still claiming she's innocent despite the overwhelming testimony that sealed her fate. Belinda Magana. Crime, murder. Belinda Magana was a Los Angeles woman whose jealousy turned from simmering suspicion into violent, premeditated murder. In 1998, Belinda believed her boyfriend was cheating on her with 23-year-old Maricela Hernandez. Consumed with rage, Belinda devised a sinister plan to confront Maricela under the guise of talking things out peacefully. On the night of the murder, Belinda lured Maricela to an isolated area. There, lying in wait, were two accomplices who shared in Belinda's deadly intentions. The conversation quickly turned into a savage beating. Maricela was stabbed multiple times and left bleeding in an abandoned lot. Witnesses later testified that the attack was planned. Belinda had every intention of ensuring Maricela wouldn't survive. Investigators pieced the case together using phone records, witness statements, and physical evidence linking Belinda to the crime scene. When questioned, Belinda initially denied any involvement. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear she had orchestrated the entire attack. At her 2001 trial, prosecutors argued the killing was fueled by possessive jealousy and the idea that if she couldn't have her boyfriend's loyalty, no one else would either. They described her as manipulative and willing to use others to carry out her rage. The jury agreed and sentenced her. Janine Snyder. Crime, first-degree murder. Janine Snyder's name became synonymous with cruelty and betrayal after the horrific crimes she committed with her boyfriend, Michael Thornton, in Riverside County. In 2001, Janine, then in her early 20s, lured 16-year-old Michelle Curran into their car by offering her a ride. But instead of kindness, Michelle was kidnapped and held captive for several days. During that time, she was repeatedly assaulted and ultimately strangled to death. Her body was dumped in a shallow grave in a remote area. What made the case even unbelievable was that Michelle was not their only victim. Another teenage girl had also been abducted by the couple, but managed to escape, leading police to Janine and Michael before they could kill again. When arrested, Janine tried to downplay her involvement, shifting the blame onto Michael, but evidence showed she wasn't a passive bystander. She actively participated in the abduction, encouraged the violence, and even helped cover up the murder. Witnesses testified that she was just as dangerous as her boyfriend. At her 2003 trial, the jury listened to harrowing details of the torture Michelle endured and concluded Janine was equally culpable in the crime. She was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The jury sentenced her to death, making Janine Snyder one of the youngest women on California's death row. Judy Buenoano. Crime, murder. Judy Buenoano was one of Florida's most notorious female serial killers, a woman who poisoned, drowned, and even bombed her way through the people closest to her for money. Her murderous pattern began in 1971 with her husband, James Goodyear. Judy laced his meals with arsenic, causing a slow and painful decline. After his death, she collected his life insurance payout and moved on. Years later, she repeated the scheme with her boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris. He too mysteriously fell ill and died, and once again Judy profited. Investigators at the time never connected the dots, but Judy's cruelty escalated further. In 1980, her own son, Michael, became gravely ill with arsenic poisoning, leaving him partially paralyzed. Just months later, she took him canoeing on a river near Orlando. In her account, the boat accidentally capsized, and Michael, unable to swim due to his paralysis, drowned. Judy calmly collected his life insurance money, showing no sign of grief. Her final known victim was John Gentry, a fiancé she thought was wealthy. When she discovered he wasn't as rich as she hoped, she planted a car bomb under his vehicle. He survived the explosion, and the investigation unraveled Judy's decades-long trail of suspicious deaths. In 1984, she was convicted of multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and grand theft. These women, mothers, wives, daughters, destroyed every illusion of innocence that ever stood. Some killed for love, others for jealousy, revenge, or greed, and a few killed for no reason anyone will ever truly understand. Many of these women now sit in the silence of death row cells, waiting for appeals, waiting for justice, waiting for the inevitable. But no sentence, no execution can ever bring back the lives they destroyed, or heal the ripples of pain that spread through families and communities. So what do we take away from their stories? Maybe it's a reminder that evil wears many faces, that it can be charming, maternal, or unassuming, until it strikes. And maybe it's a warning that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the monster in the dark, but the person you think you know best. These are America's most terrifying female prisoners. Their names will live on in infamy.